The Japanese combined fleet, which had ruled the Pacific only 2 years before, suffered the same devastation as the merchant marine. In the harvest year of 1944, United States submarines sank 1 battleship, 7 aircraft carriers, 2 heavy cruisers, 7 light cruisers, 30 destroyers, and 7 submarines. Before the year's end, the combined fleet, faced with a choice between a patriotic death in battle and a sordid death by fuel starvation, would sail out to commit mass self-annihilation. By January 1944, the 56 United States submarines that started the war in the Pacific had increased to almost 100, and 12 months later a total of 156 fleet boats were on hand. Among the many improvements on the latest boats was a stronger pressure hull that extended their test depth to 400 feet and enabled them, in moments of dire emergency, to go down a phenomenal 800 feet. The Bureau of Ordnance had also provided a new and radically different weapon, the Mark 18 electric torpedo. After all the headaches caused by the Mark 14 torpedo and its Mark 6 magnetic exploder, the submariners at first looked with suspicion on the Mark 18. The electric torpedo had one huge advantage over its steam-driven predecessor. It left no wake to warn its potential victims or to betray the whereabouts of the boat that fired it. The main question was whether this asset would outweigh its great disadvantage, the fact that the Mark 18, travelling at 28 to 30 knots, had just a little more than half the speed of the Mark 14. There were also a disturbing number of bugs. The tail vanes of the first models were weak and sometimes broke off during firing. The steel rudder posts were corroded by humidity, thereby impairing steering and causing the fish to run erratically. Moreover, the Mark 18 batteries exuded highly explosive hydrogen gas, which could destroy a submarine if touched off by a spark. It took a while, but one by one the problems were solved. The hydrogen menace, for example, was eliminated by a red-hot battery wire that burned the gas away as it was generated. A non-corrosive rudder post replaced the faulty original. More powerful electric motors increased the speed of the fish about 25% to 40 knots. The first Mark 18s had been delivered to Pearl Harbor in mid-1943, and by early 1944, Admiral Lockwood finally decreed that the electric torpedo was ready for war. Submarine skippers tried the Mark 18 in combat, and it passed muster in fine fashion. By July 1944, commanders were using electric torpedoes for 75% of their shots. Late that year came still another torpedo, officially designated the Mark 27, but quickly nicknamed Cutie by the men. This little fish, only 10 feet 3 inches long, exactly half the length of the Mark 14, was entirely different from the other torpedoes. Cutie was an acoustical torpedo. Its sonar units would home in on the sounds made by the target's propellers and destroy them, immobilizing the ship, which could then be sunk at leisure with standard torpedoes. The sonar units were so sensitive that if a man stroked the nose of the torpedo, its fins to the rear would automatically move to steer the fish in the direction of the slight sound made by his hand movement. Cutie was not launched in the usual manner. It swam out of the flooded torpedo tube on its own electric power. The submarine crews had to learn an entirely new mode of attack to use the acoustical torpedo. Otherwise, Cutie would listen to and turn back on the boat that had launched it. The technique was simple enough. Just before a little fish was launched at a target, the crew would begin a silent drill. All the engines aboard were shut down, including the motor on the refrigerator. With no submarine noise to distract it, the Cutie would relentlessly seek out any enemy ship within its range, 7,000 yards. It was especially useful against hard-to-hit targets, such as small, shallow-draft anti-submarine vessels. Yet a third new weapon arrived for the submarines in 1944. It came in answer to Lockwood's repeated appeals for a more powerful deck gun to replace the 3- and 4-inch pea-shooters that left the boats at a serious disadvantage in surface duels with armed merchantmen. The boats began mounting a 5-incher with twice the range and 4 times the wallop of the 3-inch deck gun. The same year, the submariners' combat kit was filled with other new tools and tricks. Their fathometer was improved. Its sound waves measured the depths of the sea without making the loud pings that revealed the submarine's position to enemy ships with listening gear. Another device turned enemy radar against itself by detecting its emissions with a special radar receiver. A decoy device, fired from torpedo tubes while a boat was being depth-charged, made loud noises to mislead anti-submarine vessels as to the boat's whereabouts. Still, another improvement was a new and large-headed night periscope, which admitted much more light and was equipped with a built-in radar that helped skippers pick out their targets. Admiral Lockwood was so delighted with the periscope that, as he later related, he played hooky from the desk to make a training trip. 2 trips, in fact, and proudly reported that even my eyes could pick up the target at 2,500 yards on a dark night. Less popular with submariners was a newly developed frequency-modulated sonar with extremely short range. It was used to detect mines and other submerged objects in a submarine's path. On contact, it made such a racket that crewmen called it Hell's Bells. The submarine skippers and crews disliked the FM sonar because it was useful only in seeking out enemy mines, and no one wanted to get involved in that dangerous operation. But it worked. In December 1944, the Tinosa would put it to superlative use in making a pre-invasion survey of the minefields all along the coast of Okinawa. By 1944, answers had been found to virtually all questions involving the use of submarines. Strategy had boiled down to a simple matter of concentrating the boats in the narrow inter-island waterways that Japanese merchantmen had to take to reach and return from their sources of raw materials in Southeast Asia and the Southwest Pacific. Tactics had become a largely academic concern. With superior weapons and a wide variety of proven attack plans, a submarine skipper was assured success provided he took normal precautions. Japanese escort vessels were dwindling in number and quality, and more frequently the supply convoys travelled unescorted. It was a time of desperation for the Japanese, and a time of slaughter for the American submarines. By now the submariners had got their target priorities sorted out, and with few enemy warships left, there was no doubt about what stood at the top of the list. Wrote Lockwood, "Tankers, those were the ships we most wanted to sink." During the 2 full years of war to date, United States submarines had managed to destroy only 22 of the big-bellied vessels upon which the enemy depended for his very life. But in January 1944 alone, they sent 8 Japanese tankers to the bottom. And on a single day in February came the feat that won for its perpetrator a nickname spun off from a fairy tale, Jack the Tanker Killer. On the morning of February 19th, during her 3rd patrol, the Jack was running on the surface in the South China Sea, where she had been alerted by code breakers to look for a Japanese convoy transporting aviation gasoline. The sea was calm, faintly lighted by starshine and a quarter moon. At 3:58 a.m., straining at the night binoculars, a lookout discerned the faint loom of a ship. Her funnel aft identified her as a tanker. Even as skipper Thomas M. Dykers called his crew to battle stations, more dark shapes marched into view on the rim of the sea. In one column were 4 tankers. Beyond was a 5th tanker, followed by 3 escorts. Dykers took aim at the last 2 ships in the nearer line and fired 4 bow torpedoes. 2 fish hit the tail-ender. In about 2 seconds, Dykers later reported, she exploded with gasoline because flames shot hundreds of feet in the air, and the whole area of the sea around the ship was instantly a seething mass of white-hot flame. With the convoy in confusion, the Jack pulled away and raced ahead on the surface, in the familiar end-around play. All that day the Jack set up her ambush, and by 3:45 p.m. she was more than 20 miles out in front of her victims. Dykers took the boat down to periscope depth and then waited for the convoy to reach his position. It arrived shortly before sunset, steaming in a square formation. For some reason, no escorts were in sight. At 6:49 p.m., Dykers fired his 4 stern tubes at 2 tankers, which at that moment offered a tempting overlapped target. Both of the ships exploded, again bathing the sea with flames that spelled death for scores of Japanese seamen. An hour later, the Jack was on the surface, hunting more game. The remaining 2 tankers had separated. One was standing off to the north, where she had finally picked up an escort. The other, zigzagging frantically to the west, was still unescorted. Dykers went after her and fired 3 torpedoes at the extreme range of 8,000 yards. 1 fish failed to run, the other 2 missed. The Jack pursued on the surface, dodging waterspouts made by shells from the tanker's deck gun. By 10:33, Dykers believed that he had solved the enemy's zigzag pattern, and he fired a salvo of 4 torpedoes. 3 hit, and the Jack's 4th victim of the day blew up in a burst of flame. Hoping for a clean sweep, Dykers chased the 5th tanker but could not catch up. Still, his day's work had made for a hugely successful patrol. Dykers wrote in the Jack's log, "There was lots of damage to the enemy, spectacular fireworks, only 2 submerged days, no depth-charging good food including ice cream almost every day." Needless to say, morale is soaring. If tankers were the favoured submarine target, troop transports ran a close second, particularly as the Japanese struggled to move reinforcements to the faraway islands now threatened with Allied reconquest. In January 1944, General MacArthur had extended his leapfrog operations along the north coast of New Guinea, a key stepping stone in his Pacific strategy. Late in April, the Japanese loaded 2 army divisions onto 9 transports, accompanied by numerous escorts, in an effort to relieve their beleaguered New Guinea garrisons. The convoy was designated Bamboo No. 1. The convoy sailed from Shanghai and soon encountered disaster. Thomas Dykers' Jack was again in the right place at the right time, northwest of Luzon on April 25th, and sank a 5,400-ton transport. All of the men on board, an army regiment of 3,000 men, went to their deaths. After putting in at Manila to reorganize, Bamboo No. 1 again got underway, and by May 6th was steaming near the north end of the Celebes Sea. Here waited Charles Herbert Andrews, the skipper who had spent his youth in embarrassing velvet knee pants, and his Gurnard, whose troublesome HOR engines had been replaced by reliable General Motors diesels. Andrews had plenty of time to get ready. Even for a convoy, Bamboo No. 1 was remarkably slow-moving. Its flagship was an old coal-burning mine layer that belched clouds of smoke as she waddled along. At about 8 a.m., Andrews spotted the smoke 19 miles away and spent 5 leisurely hours moving into position to attack. The Gurnard took aim at 2 targets, big ships in the convoy's near column. Andrews fired 6 fish, and all but one of them hit the 2 targets. The one that missed had a sensational voyage. It passed through the entire convoy and dealt a mortal blow to still another ship on the far side. A convoy escort drove the Gurnard deep. 2 hours later, she came up to periscope depth, just long enough for Andrews to photograph 3 sinking ships. Then another escort forced her deep again. When the submarine surfaced that night, the sea was empty save for 1 cripple. The gun crew finished her off. After the Gurnard's attack, the remnants of Bamboo No. 1 abandoned their efforts to reach New Guinea. The surviving transports landed their demoralized troops in Halmahera in the Moluccas and then disbanded. By the time the soldiers were ferried to New Guinea in landing barges, they were caught in the general defeat and either fled into the interior or were captured. Thus, 2 American submarines, the Jack and the Gurnard, had effectively deprived the Japanese of 2 divisions in the New Guinea campaign. In the meantime, during that same month of May, Admiral Nimitz completed plans for the United States invasion of the Marianas, key to control of the Western Pacific. Once the 3 major islands in the group, Saipan, Tinian and Guam, were captured, the United States would be able to launch further invasion forces to almost any point of the compass to the Palaus, the Philippines, Formosa, Okinawa or the Bonins. The Marianas attack was scheduled for June, and the command was assigned to Admiral Raymond Spruance, whose 5th Fleet included Carrier Task Force 58 and 128,000 Marine and Army troops. The strategic importance of the Marianas was equally obvious to the Japanese, and Admiral Sumu Toyoda, now in command of the combined fleet, looked toward the imminent gathering of America's naval might as Japan's long-awaited opportunity to destroy the United States Pacific Fleet with a single blow. In preparation, Toyoda ordered major elements of the combined fleet to assemble at Borneo's Great Tawi-Tawi anchorage. Pearl Harbor's codebreakers followed the enemy warship movements with avid interest. As the time for the invasion drew near, United States submarines began to take station, and their dispositions showed how far the American commanders had come in tactical deployment. Instead of trying to cover all fronts, they sent 28 boats to patrol the waters through which the combined fleet was most likely to pass on its way to the Marianas. 3 of these boats were assigned to keep an eye on Tawi-Tawi, and among them was Samuel Dealey's Harder. On the night of June 6th, the Harder was in Sibutu Passage, a narrow reach of water between Borneo and the Sulu archipelago, within close range of Tawi-Tawi. Radar contact was made with ships coming south, and soon thereafter 3 tankers and 2 escorting destroyers came into view. Needing speed, Dealey ordered the Harder to the surface. He was closing in when darkness fell. Soon the moon emerged from behind a cloud bank, and the submarine, drenched with pale light, was spotted by a destroyer almost 7 miles away. For a while Dealey stayed on the surface and let the pursuing Japanese ship close distance. Then he submerged, leaving the destroyer to chase the Harder's wake. Turning hard left to bring his stern tubes to bear, Dealey waited until the enemy was crossing astern a little more than 1,000 yards away. He fired 3 fish. 1 hit under the destroyer's bow, a second exploded beneath the bridge. The warship's bow went under, her stern rose out of the sea, and in scarcely 4 minutes the destroyer had vanished. Dealey returned to the surface, and the Harder was soon sighted and chased by the second destroyer. Dealey tried to repeat his previous tactic, but this time he missed with 6 torpedoes. As penance, the Harder was forced to endure several uncomfortable hours of depth charging. The next day, a 3rd destroyer sighted the Harder's periscope and charged from 3,000 yards. Dealey waited until the oncoming bow wave was only 650 yards away. He fired 3 torpedoes, straight down the throat. Number 4 was not necessary, his patrol report said. At range of 300 yards, we were rocked by a terrific explosion believed to have been the destroyer's magazine. In less than 1 minute after the first hit, and 9 minutes after it was sighted, the destroyer sank tail first. On the night of June 9th, Dealey sighted 2 Japanese destroyers patrolling the narrow northern neck of Sibutu Passage. At 3,000 yards, the destroyers zigged to starboard and presented Dealey with an overlap. It was, said Dealey later, just what the doctor ordered for the Harder. He fired 4 fish and kept the periscope up to watch where they went. Number 1 appeared to pass just ahead of the first destroyer, read Dealey's battle report. Number 2 struck it near the bow. Number 3 hit just under the destroyer's bridge. The second destroyer came into view just astern of what was left of the first one, then burning furiously. Just then, number 4 torpedo was heard and observed to hit the second target. Meanwhile, a heavy explosion, believed to be caused by an exploding boiler on the first destroyer, went off and the sub was heeled over by the concussion. At almost the same time, a blinding explosion took place on the second destroyer, and it took a quick nosedive. When last observed by the commanding officer and executive officer, the tail of the second destroyer was straight up in the air, and the first destroyer had disappeared. One more adventure awaited the Harder on her extraordinary cruise. On the evening of June 10th, while patrolling at periscope depth off Tawi-Tawi, Dealey spotted a huge task force about 8 miles distant. Attempting to close, he was shaken by the awesome sight of 2 battleships and several cruisers plus numerous escorts. The Harder was denied a shot at the capital targets. A Japanese aircraft, spotting her periscope, dropped a smoke bomb, and a destroyer cut away from the force and came boiling in at 35 knots. "We had to hit him, or else," Dealey's report said. From 1,500 yards, the Harder fired 3 bow torpedoes head-on. 2 torpedoes struck with a detonation that was far worse than depth charging, the report continued. By this time we were just passing 80 feet, and were soon almost beneath the destroyer when all hell broke loose. Either his boilers or magazines, or both, had exploded, and it's a lucky thing that ship explosions are vented upward and not down. Dealey claimed that the Harder had sunk 5 destroyers. However, official post-war accounting gave her credit for 3 ships sunk and 2 damaged. In any event, when the Harder returned to Darwin, she received an enthusiastic welcome. General MacArthur ordered the Army's Distinguished Service Cross conferred upon Dealey, and Admiral Ralph Christie requested and got a Presidential Unit citation for the Harder. For his astounding patrol, however, Dealey paid a price beyond calculation. "Sam was showing unmistakable signs of strain," recalled the Harder's executive officer. "He was becoming quite casual about Japanese anti-submarine measures. Once, on the previous patrol, I found Sam in a state of mild shock, unable to make a decision." Admiral Christie was hesitant about sending Dealey with the Harder on another patrol. He yielded only when Dealey stubbornly insisted, "I have got to make this patrol." On the 24th of August, Samuel Dealey and the Harder were at sea once more, this time in company with the Hake off Dassault Bay in Lingayen Gulf. Both submarines went deep to evade a Japanese minesweeper that was pinging for targets with its sonar gear. The Hake's skipper counted 15 depth charges. The Harder and Dealey were never seen again. Dealey was posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor for his exploits off Tawi-Tawi. A number of other United States captains had an exciting time of it in June in the waters off Tawi-Tawi. From the moment the Japanese combined fleet sorted on its way to what would become renowned as the Battle of the Philippine Sea, its units were scouted and hectored by United States submarines. At 10 a.m. on June 13th, Marshal H. Austin, commanding the Redfin, saw the Japanese fleet emerging from anchorage, destroyers in the van, then heavy cruisers, followed by 6 carriers, then 4 battleships, with more cruisers and destroyers in the rear. Unable to reach attack position submerged, Austin trailed the enemy fleet and filed a crucial report on its progress. The Japanese were split into 3 sections, each one taking a different route. On the evening of June 15th, Robert Risser in the Flying Fish spotted a group near San Bernardino Strait in the Philippines. An hour later, Slade D. Cutter in the Seahorse, 200 miles east of Surigao Strait, saw smoke and later identified and reported plenty of battleships. Cutter tried to attack, but trouble with one of his 4 diesel engines prevented him from catching up. Another contact report from the Kavala, more than 350 miles east of San Bernardino Strait, started a train of events that cost Japan an aircraft carrier. On June 17th, the Kavala was chasing a fleet supply convoy when Herman Kostler, making his first war patrol as a submarine commander, encountered and reported another force of 15 or more large combatant ships. From Pearl, Admiral Lockwood instructed the Kavala to divert her pursuit to the warships. Kostler trailed the Japanese ships for 54 hours. At about 11 o'clock on the morning of June 19th, he raised the Kavala's periscope and saw a picture too good to be true. There, within range, stood the great carrier Shokaku, veteran of the Pearl Harbor attack and the Battle of the Coral Sea. The Shokaku was recovering aircraft. She and her escorts were apparently too preoccupied to watch for the likes of the Kavala. With deliberation, Kostler closed to 1,200 yards and fired all 6 forward tubes. Then he went deep and heard 3 distinct hits. Over the next 3 hours, more than 100 depth charges came down at the Kavala. When Kostler was able to bring his boat to the surface again that night, the sea was empty. He reported hitting a Shokaku-class carrier and added, "Believe that baby sank." He was right. 4 of the Kavala's 6 fish had hit the Shokaku, and the fires they set triggered internal explosions that doomed the carrier. The 30,000-ton giant slowed, stopped, and began settling by the bow. Water rose to the hangar deck and flooded in. 3 hours after Kostler fired his fish, the Shokaku rolled over and went down. Meanwhile, to the northwest, another submarine found herself right in the middle of an enemy carrier force. At around 7 a.m. on June 19th, skipper James W. Blanchard brought the albacore to periscope depth and caught sight of a carrier plane crossing his field of vision. Blanchard ducked down for fear of being seen, waited for an hour, and then stuck the scope up again. This time he saw, more than 7 miles distant, a carrier, a cruiser, and the masts of several other warships. Blanchard swung around to pursue, but in turning he saw another carrier and its cortege less than 3 miles away. He immediately shifted targets. Calculating the carrier's speed at 27 knots, Blanchard planned to fire at a range of only 1,950 yards, but his torpedo data computer suddenly went haywire and began feeding him wildly inaccurate firing data. Cursing the instrument, Blanchard closed in and fired 6 forward tubes, by seaman's eye. Then he dived to escape the depth charging that was certain to follow. Although he had little hope of hitting the carrier, Blanchard did hear what he thought were explosions while the albacore was heading down. But he felt so little confidence in his offhand aim that he did not even make a radio report of his attack. After the boat had weathered the depth charges and completed her patrol, Blanchard merely mentioned the incident in his report. Actually, one of the albacore's 6 fish had smashed into the Taiho, then Japan's newest and biggest 31,000 tons carrier, and the flagship of Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa, commander of the Japanese battle force. The torpedo hit the Taiho's forward aircraft elevator, ruptured fuel tanks, and filled the elevator pit with sloshing gasoline. The damage was not considered serious, and the Taiho continued launching her planes. But then the damage control party made a fatal error. It started the ship's ventilation system in an effort to disperse the gasoline fumes. Instead, the fans spread the volatile gases everywhere. A little more than 6 hours after the torpedo hit, the Taiho was racked by a monstrous explosion. The flight deck buckled and the sides of the ship blew outward. The Taiho was done for. At first, Admiral Ozawa was determined to die with his ship, but staff officers persuaded him to live and fight on. Taking along the revered portraits of the Emperor and Empress, he transferred to the carrier Haguro. Soon another explosion ripped the Taiho asunder, and she went down, taking along 1,650 of her officers and men. By destroying 2 carriers in the Battle of the Philippine Sea, United States submarines had made a signal contribution to the surface fleet's momentous victory. In turn, that triumph sealed the successful invasion of the Marianas, which paid handsome dividends for the submarines in the form of new advance bases on Saipan and Guam. This was the third and most beneficial of the base advances. In late 1942, refueling and maintenance facilities had been established among the Goonie birds at Midway. This base modestly improved the lot of the submariners, who had been forced to use up a large part of their fuel to reach their main hunting grounds from either Pearl Harbor or Australia. The second advance had come with the capture of the Marshalls in early 1944. The new base built there in the Majuro Atoll was about 2,000 miles closer to Japan, yet submarines still had to travel some 3,000 miles to reach the enemy homeland. But now new bases went up at Tanapag Harbor on Saipan and Apra Harbor on Guam, and these put the submariners within a 3 days' journey of Tokyo Bay, thus greatly extending the time that the boats could spend on their destructive patrols. The Japanese captains, Navy and merchant alike, soon were haunted by the change. Faced with more United States submarines on longer hunts over a shrinking front, they set out on their voyages half expecting to be torpedoed no matter what course they set, and the larger view was far more alarming to the Japanese High Command. With the Marianas and most of New Guinea in American hands, it was clear that General MacArthur's long-threatened return to the Philippines could not be far away. To protect against that dreaded day, the Japanese rushed troop reinforcements and supplies to the islands and into the prime hunting grounds of the American submarines. Thus, in Luzon Strait early on the morning of July 31st, came about one of the Pacific War's wildest melees. On joint patrol were the Steelhead, under Commander David L. Welchel, and Lawson P. Ramage's Pash. For 2 weeks they had been having miserable luck. Several prizes had slipped away. As he had demonstrated by his outspoken criticism of the Mark 14 torpedo, Ramage was by no means long on patience, and by July 30th he was furious. That morning, Welchel and Ramage sighted convoy smoke and pursued. When Welchel made out the convoy itself, the Japanese were sailing under a forbidding umbrella of aircraft. It would be self-annihilation for the boats to attack during daylight. At about 3 a.m. on the 31st, the submarines closed in. At 3:32, the Steelhead unloaded 6 torpedoes at a tanker and a big freighter. The freighter was hit and later sank. Smoke erupted from the tanker, but she did not go down. Welchel later sank a Japanese transport. Welchel's savage attack set the convoy to firing fusillades of warning flares. These served only to silhouette the merchantmen and their escorts for Ramage in the Pash, charging hard on the surface. The prospects looked chancy. 1 escort was ahead of the Pash to starboard, and 2 more were to port. All were between the submarine and the convoy. Ramage kept his boat on the surface at full speed in a hard curve to starboard. The manoeuvre brought the Pash full circle and between the escorts and the convoy, which had meanwhile changed course and was steaming straight at the submarine. While aiming for a freighter, Ramage came too close to her. To avoid ramming, he swung the Pash hard right and went by the freighter, firing 2 forward torpedoes in passing. Both of the fish missed, but as the Pash raced on, heading for 2 tankers off to starboard, Ramage fired a farewell stern shot at the freighter and it hit, although the ship did not sink. Closing in on the 2 tankers, Ramage got off 4 torpedoes at the one in the lead. The first fish blew off the tanker's bow, and the others ripped her from midships to rudder. It was a struggle for the Parsh's torpedo men to load their tubes as fast as Ramage emptied them, for even as the first tanker was going under, Ramage put 3 torpedoes into the other one, damaging her bow with 2 and leaving her crippled. The night sky was lighted up by burning ships. By now, every ship in the convoy was firing at the racing submarine. Tracers reached out for her and shell bursts splashed around her. Ramage stayed on the bridge with a volunteer, but sent everyone else below. He kept the boat speeding along and swerving wildly. "I called on the engine house," he said later, "to pour in all the oil they had. He fired 5 torpedoes one after another. Some hit, but in all the confusion Ramage had no idea how much damage they had caused. Now a small freighter aimed herself at the Parsh and came rushing in to ram. Ramage swung the boat hard right, passed down the enemy's beam a bare 50 feet away, and found himself boxed in on 3 sides by furiously firing escorts with a big ship dead ahead. Ramage fired 3 forward tubes. One missed, but the next 2 caught the big ship. It was a passenger cargo vessel near the bow. The vessel came to a halt. Ramage ran past her, swung to port and fired 1 stern fish. It hit amidships. As Ramage manoeuvred for a finishing blow, the ship sank by the bow and went under. Suddenly it was all over. There were still several small craft and escorts around, Ramage recalled, but no worthwhile targets that we could see. I decided to put some distance between us and this hornet's nest. In 46 minutes, Ramage had fired 19 torpedoes. Post-war accounting gave the Parsh credit for a 10,200-ton tanker, a 4,400-ton passenger cargo vessel, and a half share with the Steelhead for an 8,990-ton transport. The Steelhead sank a 7,100-ton freighter and an 8,200-ton transport. Ramage was awarded the Medal of Honor, less for what he had done than for the way he had done it. He was the first living submariner to receive the decoration. When he was asked what had inspired his furious rush at the convoy, Ramage shrugged and said, "I got mad." The Welchel-Ramage shootout in Luzon Strait dramatized the fact that there were rich pickings to be had in this ocean bottleneck where Japanese convoy routes converged. As the summer of 1944 wore on, Admiral Lockwood sent his Wolfpacks there in increasing numbers. The result was calamitous for Japan. In mid-August, 2 small packs were patrolling in or near the strait. One pack, led by Glyn Donahoe in the Picuda, included Gordon Underwood in the Spadefish and Louis D. McGregor in the Redfish. Another pack, consisting of Henry Munson's Rasher and Charles Henderson's Bluefish, was hunting nearby. For a while the boats had no luck, but around 5 a.m. on August 18th, in rainy weather, the Redfish made contact with a large convoy. McGregor fired at 3 and missed them all, but on receiving his report, the other 4 boats raced to join the Redfish. Munson in the Rasher made a radar contact with the convoy on the night of the 18th. It was a huge convoy of 20 cargo ships and 15 escorts, lumbering along 15,000 yards away. Munson closed in through the heavy rain, which he considered absolutely ideal for night attack. At a range of 2,800 yards, Munson fired 2 torpedoes at what seemed to be a big tanker. Both fish hit, and, recalled Munson, the entire sky was a bright red momentarily, and the target and the whole convoy was seen for an instant. Part of the ship blew off and landed about 500 yards from the remainder of the tanker, and both parts burned fiercely for about 20 minutes, and then disappeared from sight in one grand final explosion. Munson had been wrong about one thing. His victim, far from being a tanker, was a 20,000-ton aircraft carrier. Munson had every reason to expect an energetic counterattack, but none materialized. He later wrote, "The rear escort decided something was wrong. He fired his guns at all points of the compass, reversed course, and fiercely depth-charged something or other 2 miles astern of us. Pandemonium reigned in the convoy. Lights flashed on and off. Depth charges fell in every direction. Gunfire broke out all over. 2 ships appeared to indulge in a spirited gun duel for a few moments. We proceeded up the starboard side of the convoy about 4,000 yards off, reloading and enjoying the spectacle. He now had 16 torpedoes remaining, and at 3,300 yards he fired 10 of them at 2 cargo ships. He got both of them. 2 fish missed their targets but slammed into 2 other ships beyond. Then he moved off to reload, and with only 6 torpedoes left, he radioed for help. The rasher closed in again, and Munson saw that the convoy had split into small groups. He chased 2 large ships flanked by a pair of smaller vessels. Slanting across the group's course, he fired all 6 of his torpedoes at the large ships. 5 hit, sinking one vessel and damaging the other. Fresh out of fish, Munson ended his chase before dawn, but his rainy night's work had sunk 4 enemy ships totaling 47,928 tons, one of the most fruitful one-day ship performances of the war. Munson's attack had sent the big convoy scattering in confusion, and now other members of the Wolfpacks circled in for their terminations. Henderson in the Bluefish sank a 6,500-ton tanker. Around 3 a.m. on August 19th, Underwood in the Spadefish came upon more stragglers, fired at a 9,500-ton transport and hit her. "Loud explosion from target," he reported. "Radar pip died down and disappeared. No doubt about this fellow." On August 22nd, Underwood came upon another convoy, 2 large tankers with escorts. He fired a total of 6 torpedoes, 3 at each tanker. The first one sank, adding another 10,000 tons to Underwood's score. The second ship, although badly damaged, escaped into Pasaleng Bay on the coast of Luzon. Underwood pursued the stricken tanker into the bay, but was driven off by a patrolling destroyer. At this point, Underwood was running out of torpedoes, and upon orders from Donohoe, he set out for Saipan to get a new load. Donohoe and McGregor had so far gone empty-handed, but near the Luzon coast on the 25th of August, Donohoe in the Picuda came upon a 10-ship convoy and sank a 2,000-ton transport. Then, when a destroyer charged him, he sank her too with a down-the-throat shot to chalk up another 1,200 tons. Alerted by the explosions, McGregor manoeuvred his redfish into position and atoned for his earlier misses, sinking a 6,000-ton freighter with 3 torpedoes. Donohoe and McGregor were now short of fuel. They too hurried 1,600 miles to Saipan to replenish, then returned to Luzon Strait. Underwood arrived first, and on September 8th he sent his Spadefish into a convoy of 8 big ships with escorts. In superbly executed attacks, he sank 4 ships for 12,000 tons. On September 16th, Donohoe's Picuda found another convoy, and this time sank one 6,000-ton freighter. From the same convoy, McGregor's Redfish took a 7,300-ton tanker. 2 more ships went down on September 21st. A 2,000-tonner fell victim to Donohoe, and an 8,500-ton transport to McGregor. Thus, this one 3-boat Wolfpack had, with time out for the trip to Saipan and back, sunk 13 ships totaling about 65,000 tons in less than 1 month. During that same period, another Luzon Strait Wolfpack had fantastic success, although at a stiff price in Allied lives. The pack included the Pampanito under Paul Summers, Eli Reich's Sealion II, named after the first submarine casualty of the war, and the Growler, commanded by Thomas B. Oakley, Jr., who had taken over after the former skipper, Howard Gilmore, had sacrificed his life to save the boat. The 3 submarines were alerted by codebreakers that an important convoy was coming up from Singapore, and they lay in wait. On the night of September 11th, they made contact. Oakley attacked first, sinking a frigate and a destroyer. Reich in the Sealion II moved in and fired at a tanker and 2 transports. Both transports were sent to the bottom. Though the submarine commanders had no way of knowing it, the larger transport, the Rakuyo Maru, was carrying 1,350 British and Australian prisoners of war who were being shipped from Malaya to Japan. The remainder of the convoy fled westward. Summers pursued in the Pampanito. Reich, who had submerged to escape depth charges, finally surfaced and also headed after the convoy. On September 13th, the Pampanito caught up with the convoy and sank a tanker and a transport off Hainan Island. Then she returned to the strait and came to the area where the Rakuyo Maru had gone down with the Allied prisoners. The sea was strewn with cadavers floating in life jackets, and a few living men were clinging to small rafts and flotsam. Summers radioed to Reich for help and set to work, picking up the exhausted survivors, a pitiful sight none of us would ever forget. The Sealion II arrived, and that night the 2 submarines gathered in 127 men. In the meantime, Reich had radioed Lockwood, and the admiral immediately ordered to the scene from a nearby patrol area Eugene B. Fluckey's Barb and Charles Laughlin's Queenfish. On the night of September 16th, still 150 miles short of their destination, the two new rescue boats got a convoy contact and decided to delay the Mercy mission long enough to attack. Fluckey moved in, believing that the targets were tankers, but then, in the darkness, he made out something else. "Yeah, gods, a flat top," he wrote. "This is undoubtedly the prettiest target I have ever seen." Working his way into 1,820 yards, Fluckey fired all 6 of his bow tubes. Soon he heard breaking up noises, very heavy underwater explosions, whistlings, cracklings. That turned out to be one of the most lucrative spreads of the war. Fluckey had not only sunk a 20,000-ton carrier, but also an 11,000-ton tanker, which had overlapped the warship. Then the Barb and the Queenfish went on to the rescue job and picked up 32 more survivors. Meanwhile, United States submarines were busy exploiting another bottleneck even more important than Luzon Strait. This was the narrow Formosa Strait, between the Chinese mainland and the island of Formosa. Offering little room for ships to maneuver, the strait was an ideal place for submarines to lurk in ambush. The great bulk of Japanese shipping passed through here on the way to and from the South China Sea. Unfortunately for the Americans, however, the enemy held the coasts on both sides of the strait, making it as perilous for the hunters as for the hunted. Formosa Strait was, in short, just the sort of place to which the daredevil Richard O'Kane would enjoy taking the Tang. O'Kane, who as executive officer on Mushmorton's Wahoo had been so dramatically transformed by battle, was the only skipper the Tang had ever had or ever would have. She was a relatively new fleet boat, having been in service only 9 months by October of 1944, but she was already famed within the silent service. During the submarine's first 4 patrols, O'Kane had sunk 17 Japanese ships for a total of 82,000 tons. Now, for the Tang's 5th patrol, Admiral Lockwood offered O'Kane a choice of duty in Formosa Strait to join a Wolfpack or to go alone. O'Kane chose the lone expedition. In these narrow waters on the night of October 10th, O'Kane sank 2 freighters. For nearly 2 weeks thereafter, the Tang's SJ radar picked up nothing but the blips of nearby coastal islands. Then, in the early morning hours of October 23rd, the radarman reported contact with 4 enemy freighters, a transport and some escorting vessels. Maneuvering on the surface, but apparently undiscovered as yet, the Tang carefully worked her way inside the escort screen and joined the convoy. There, at a range of only 800 yards, O'Kane emptied 5 forward tubes at the freighters. 3 of the ships blazed up like gigantic torches, flooding the rest of the convoy with light. In the lurid glare, a lookout aboard the Tang saw the transport turning and coming in to ram at top speed. But luck was with O'Kane. The transport captain and crew were so intent on ramming the submarine that they failed to notice another freighter that was also churning toward the Tang with intent to ram. On converging courses, the 2 Japanese ships collided with a great crash and grinding of metal. At just about the same time, O'Kane fired 4 stern torpedoes at a range of only 400 yards. When the fish exploded, the freighter quickly nosed under, while the transport lay helpless, stern down, with her bow up at a 30-degree angle. But now an escort was heading full tilt toward the Tang. Running a colossal bluff, O'Kane charged the oncoming enemy. The Japanese wavered and sheered off, and the Tang retired safely into the darkness. From first torpedo to the last explosion, 10 minutes had elapsed. 24 hours later, the Tang made contact with a second convoy, setting off another wild brawl. Because of a disastrous fluke, this was to be the Tang's last fight. Again, O'Kane went in on the surface, but this time the boat was detected before she came into torpedo range. Japanese escorts began firing 5-inch and 40mm shells, churning the sea around the submarine. At a range of around 1,000 yards, O'Kane fired his forward tubes at a tanker and 2 transports, each carrying bulky deck loads. All 3 ships were hit. O'Kane swung the Tang right to bring the stern tubes to bear on 2 ships in the second column. But just as O'Kane was ready to fire, he saw the onrushing bow of a destroyer escort. "Fire!" he shouted, and in almost the same breath, "All ahead flank!" The Tang pulled clear, with the escort's salvos falling into the gouts of smoke left behind by the boat's labouring diesels. Once away from the shattered convoy, O'Kane ordered the Tang's last 2 Mark 18 electric fish checked and loaded in the stern tubes. An hour later, he ran back toward the Japanese, intending to finish off a transport damaged by his hasty stern shot. It was now 2:30 in the morning, October 25th, and the Tang fired the last 2 torpedoes of her life. The first ran true and hit the transport. The second fish travelled erratically in a wide arc, broke to the surface a few hundred yards ahead of the Tang's bow, and then turned sharply left toward the submarine. At emergency speed, the Tang fishtailed in a desperate effort to get out of the path of the turning torpedo, but to no avail. The runaway fish struck the submarine abreast the after-torpedo room, and 570 pounds of torpex exploded with a violence that almost tore off the boat's stern. The Tang started down. The tremendous impact of the blast hurled O'Kane and the 8 other men on the bridge into the sea. As the Tang went under, another member of the crew struggled out of the conning tower. Inside the steeply tilted submarine, amid the jumble of bodies and loose gear crashing aft, the men who were still alive responded automatically to the submariner's basic instinct to put things right as quickly as possible. They dogged the hatches to the damaged after end of the boat and flooded forward ballast tanks to bring the submarine to an even keel. The Tang settled ponderously to the bottom at 180 feet. There were 30 survivors, several of them badly hurt. The wounded men were carried into the forward torpedo room where the escape hatch was located. There, several men thought of the submariner's final duty when abandoning ship and made an attempt to burn codebooks and classified papers. But there was not enough time. A fire broke out in the forward battery room, blistering paint on the torpedo room bulkhead and sending acrid curls of smoke seeping around the gasket. The men climbed through the escape hatch into an airlock, a chamber whose pressure could be equalized to that outside the submarine, thus permitting an outer door to be opened. In all, 13 men in groups of 2 or 3 went through the airlock into the sea, breathing recycled oxygen through the face masks of their Momsen lungs. The remaining men were probably asphyxiated by the smoke from the battery room fire. Of the 13 who escaped, 8 reached the surface alive, and 5 managed to stay afloat until morning, clinging to a life ring. 4 of the men who had been flung from the bridge also lasted out the night in the sea. Among them was O'Kane. In the morning, a Japanese patrol boat, on the scene to rescue survivors from the ships that the Tang had sunk, took aboard the 9 live American submariners. All of them survived the war, and Richard Hetherington O'Kane, United States Navy, later emerged from Japanese imprisonment to receive the Medal of Honor. O'Kane and his crew had gone into their last fight, while the United States was taking another giant step closer to victory in the Pacific. On October 20th, 1944, General MacArthur at last made good his dramatic promise to the world, and American troops began landing on the eastern shore of Leyte in the central Philippines. Late that night, a dozen boats were deployed to spot, report on, and, if possible, attack the Japanese combined fleet, which was on its way to smash the United States invasion force. That, at least, was the Japanese fleet's assignment in what soon became the epic battle for Leyte Gulf. Early on the morning of October 23rd, off Mindoro Island at Cape Calavite, the Bream picked up a radar contact with 3 warships, which her veteran skipper Rafford Chappell identified as 2 heavy cruisers and 1 light cruiser. The Bream pursued for 40 minutes and came up close to one of the heavy cruisers. In Chappell's words, men could be plainly seen running to their battle stations as the big baby drew up on our port quarter only 800 yards away. Chappell fired 6 torpedoes and dealt the cruiser Aoba a smashing blow. The warship was out of the battle for Leyte Gulf, though she stayed afloat. Early that same morning in the southwest Philippines, David McClintock in the Data and the Dace under her new skipper Bladen Claggett rendezvoused near the head of Palawan Passage. The skippers were calling back and forth by megaphone when McClintock suddenly yelled, "We have contact! Let us go!" The Data and the Dace chased the radar blip for 5 hours, gradually identifying the enemy warships as battleships and cruisers. In fact, the Japanese had divided their fleet for a 3-pronged attack. This was the main force, including the giant battleships Musashi and Yamato, both of which had been damaged by submarines in earlier encounters. The Japanese were moving slowly, enabling the two United States boats to get into favorable position. At 5:09 a.m., McClintock took the Darter down, soon followed by Claggett in the Dace. The final moments of the Darter's long, close-in approach were tense. The operator of the target data computer kept yelling for a range. The executive officer kept asking, "What's there?" And McClintock, glued to the periscope, kept replying, "Battleships, cruisers, battleships, cruisers." Finally, the TDC man got his range, cranked it into his computer and gave the torpedo settings to the skipper. At 5:32, McClintock fired the Darter's 6 bow tubes at one cruiser, then swung the submarine hard left to fire all 4 stern tubes at another. The fish began hitting, and, curiosity getting the better of him, McClintock kept the scope up for a look before going deep. "Whipped periscope back to the first target to see the sight of a lifetime," he said in his report. Cruiser was so close that all of her could not be seen at once with periscope in high power. She was a mass of billowing black smoke from the number 1 turret to the stern. Cruiser was already going down by the bow. McClintock had sunk the heavy cruiser Atago, which happened to be Vice Admiral Takao Kurita's flagship. Kurita lived to transfer his flag to the Yamato, but he had to swim to reach his rescuers, so swiftly did the Atago go down. Then McClintock took the Darter deep to avoid a depth charging. He had heard 4 hits on his second target, the heavy cruiser Takao. Although she was badly damaged, the Takao still floated. In the Dace, Bladen Claggett had so far been out of the action. At 5:52, 2 cruisers passed ahead of him at about 1,500 yards, presenting a beautiful overlapping target. But Claggett passed them up for a third target he believed to be a battleship. He fired all 6 forward tubes. His report heard 2 tremendous explosions both on sound and through the hull. These explosions were apparently magazines, as I have never heard anything like it. Heard tremendous breaking up noises. This was the most gruesome sound I have ever heard. It was the death rattle not of a battleship, but rather of the heavy cruiser Maya. The Darter and the Dace remained submerged for the next few hours. In the meantime, the damaged cruiser Takao lay motionless in the water through most of the day. But with aircraft overhead and Guardian destroyers circling the ship, neither the Darter nor the Dace could get in position for another shot. Finally, the Japanese repair parties got the Takao underway at a limping 6 knots. The 2 American skippers planned their pursuit and a night attack to finish her off. But then a navigational error spelled disaster for the Darter. At 5 minutes after midnight on October 24th, while threading her way through a shoal area aptly marked "dangerous ground" on the charts, the Darter ran aground so hard that McClintock thought at first that he had been torpedoed. The boat was hopelessly stuck. McClintock radioed the Dace and ordered his crew to burn or destroy all of the stranded boat's secret gear. The Dace took off the Darter's crew and, after unsuccessful attempts to destroy the Darter, set course for Fremantle. The Darter remained on the shoal, a strafing target for Japanese planes. The Darter and Dace's action ended the part played by United States submarines in the battle for Leyte Gulf. From then on, the big surface warships and hordes of United States carrier planes took over to the ruination of the Japanese combined fleet. Of the 64 Japanese warships that took part in the sprawling conflict, 26 were sent to the bottom. Not a single shot did that once mighty fleet fire at the United States troops, whose landing was already secured in any case. Never again would the fleet sail forth to seek battle. Even though the combined fleet was finished as an integral fighting force, the Japanese did have surviving capital ships. Now, in late November, they were sailing alone or in small groups, and the submarines picked them off one by one. Off Shanghai in the East China Sea in the black, moonless early hours of November 21st, Eli Reich in the Sealion II picked up a radar contact at 20 miles. Reich closed at flank speed. At 3,000 yards, he realized that his targets were 2 battleships and 2 destroyers. He fired his 6 forward tubes at one battle wagon, then turned and fired 3 stern tubes at the second. From the bridge, Reich saw 3 hits on his first target, but the stern shots blew up a destroyer that had accidentally got in the way. The wounded battle wagon slowed and dropped behind her sister until she was making only 11 knots. The Sealion II's torpedo men reloaded while Reich maneuvered for the coup de grace. But before Reich could fire, the battleship blew up. Reich reported in the log, Tremendous explosion dead ahead, sky brilliantly illuminated. It looked like a sunset at midnight. Radar reports battleship Pip getting smaller, that it has disappeared. Battleship sunk, the sun set. The Celian too had sunk the Congo, veteran of the Pearl Harbor attack, and many an action since. Her companion, the Haruna, got away. Another, even larger capital ship was sent down 8 days later by the Archerfish, commanded by Joseph F. Enright. This submarine was originally assigned to patrol southward from the entrance to Tokyo Bay as lifeguard for a B-29 strike at Tokyo, but she had been excused from that duty when the strike was called off. Skipper Enright was a second-timer in command. Earlier in the war, he had taken the dace on her first patrol, but had then asked to be relieved because he doubted his own ability. However, he had regained his confidence and would soon prove his abilities even to his own satisfaction. Around 9 p.m. on November 28th, the Archerfish picked up a radar contact more than 14 miles away. Enright ordered a chase at flank speed, and within an hour he was able to identify his target as a carrier, headed south at a speed of 20 knots. From here on, Enright wrote later, it was a mad race for a possible firing position. His speed was about 1 knot in excess of our best, but his zig plan allowed us to pull ahead very slowly. All the same, Enright despaired of getting in an effective shot until, at 3 a.m. on November 29th, the carrier took another zag which put her directly in the submarine's sights. Enright submerged, and 16 minutes later, at the ideal range of 1,500 yards, he fired 4 forward tubes. Then, as the carrier zigged, he fired 2 more from the stern. The first torpedo run was 47 seconds, with the others following at close intervals. At the periscope, Enright saw his first fish hit astern. 10 seconds later, another hit farther forward. Large ball of fire climbed his side, Enright noted. The Archerfish headed down to evade an oncoming destroyer. On the way, Enright heard 4 more hits. He stayed down until 6:10 a.m. and then rose to periscope depth for a look. The sea was empty. Enright believed that he had sunk a 28,000-ton Hayataki-class carrier. After the war, he learned that he had actually sunk the Shinano, 59,000 tons, and by far the biggest flat-top ever built to that time. She had, in fact, originally been laid down as a battle wagon and was intended to be a sister ship to the Musashi and the Yamato, but she had been converted to a carrier during her construction. Enright had got her on her first voyage. By the end of 1944, a number of submarine captains shared Enright's qualms about their ability to handle the responsibilities thrust upon them. It was natural enough. The new skippers were younger on the average than those who had started the war. But most of them, like Enright, met the challenge. George Grider was no exception, though he was a veteran submariner when he received his first command. His boat was the Flasher, already a famous submarine. Under her only previous captain, Reuben Whittaker, she had sunk 60,846 tons of enemy shipping and was among the top scorers in the service. I had become conditioned to the idea of calling the captain in any emergency, Grider recalled. Now, suddenly, there was no one to call but me. A lonely feeling and a disquieting one. But Grider need not have worried. He had learned his business well in the old Wahoo under Morton and O'Kane. Grider made his first patrol as a skipper in company with the Hawkbill and the Vicuna. Their hunting grounds were west of Mindoro in the Philippines. On the morning of December 4th, following several days of storm and poor visibility, the Flasher was 200 miles to the west of Mindoro and approximately 15 miles out of position when she received from the Hawkbill a contact report on a Japanese convoy that was heading west. The Flasher was lucky. Her navigational error had put her directly on the convoy's track. She submerged and prepared to attack. I stood in the quiet conning tower, wrote Grider, feeling the rush of blood to my skin, knowing that the test I had dreamed and wondered and worried about was upon me at last. Then the Flasher ran into a series of squalls. The boat was groping through a cloudburst, her periscope useless, when Grider's executive officer, Lieutenant Commander Philip T. Glennon, reported the sound of rapid screws approaching. Straining at the periscope, Grider suddenly made out a grey silhouette in the curtain of rain. "It is a destroyer," he shouted, and he called out the firing data for the torpedo officer. Grider fired 4 fish and heard 2 hits. Long after, he would still remember the moment. Even as I swung the scope to look, A feeling of exaltation like nothing I had ever experienced swept over me. By heaven, I had paid my way as a skipper. He continued to pay it. He made out a big tanker beyond the sinking destroyer and fired 2 torpedoes. Then, seeing a second escort vessel charging at the flasher, he went deep, and on the way down both torpedoes were heard to explode. Glennon breathed. "My God, we hit him!" Then came the depth charge punishment, and an hour and a half passed before it seemed safe to come up to periscope depth. Grider found the tanker burning and settling aft. Another destroyer, mysteriously stopped, lay between the flasher and the tanker. Grider fired 4 tubes, 2 set shallow for the destroyer, 2 set deep for the tanker. Then he was forced deep again. That afternoon he surfaced. Both destroyers had sunk. The tanker was still burning and, upon examination, proved to be abandoned. Grider fired 1 more destroyer shot at the tanker. The explosion blew out the fire, causing some distress to Grider, who had hoped to photograph a burning victim. Then the tanker went down. Grider's first attacks had sunk 1 10,000-ton tanker and 2 destroyers of 2,100 tons each, a fair bag for any normal 24-torpedo patrol. But the flasher still had 15 fish in the tubes and on the racks, and to use them up, George Grider turned his submarine westward toward the Indochina coast and Cam Ranh Bay. On December 21st, in heavy weather, the submarine spotted a convoy of 4 big tankers and their escorts. With the sea too turbulent for accurate shooting, Grider let them go by and then pursued, waiting for the weather to abate. By the time the seas calmed, the flasher had lost contact, and Grider cursed himself for poor judgment. As the afternoon wore away, I went bitterly to the wardroom for a glum dinner at which no one spoke to me, and I spoke to no one, he wrote later. The radar screen remained empty until 1 a.m. on December 22nd, when the scope showed what appeared to be a small island moving on a steady course. It was, in fact, the tightly clustered convoy, hugging the coast 12 miles from land in very shallow water. The relief that swept over me was tremendous, Grider recalled. I felt like a prisoner who has been reprieved on his way to the death chamber. When it proved impossible to get past the tanker's escorts from the seaward side, Grider took the flasher ahead and around the convoy to hit from the dangerous shallows on the land side. In one slashing attack, the flasher sent 3 more tankers to the ocean bottom for a total of 28,638 tons. With the tanker sunk earlier, the flasher had accounted for the highest tonnage of tankers sunk by any submarine on a single patrol. On a later patrol, the flasher managed to sink an insignificant 850-ton freighter. But when all the numbers were added up, that last minor sinking had raised the flasher's total tonnage destroyed under her 2 captains to 100,231. That was the highest score in the war, followed closely by the Rasher with 99,901. However, skippers were ranked by the number of ships they sank, not by total tonnage. By the end of 1944, the United States submarines had virtually worked themselves out of a job, at least so far as their primary mission of sinking enemy ships was concerned. Their enormous year-long toll of steel-hulled ships had finished off Japan's merchant fleet. What shipping remained was either out of reach in the Yellow Sea and the Sea of Japan, or hugging the coasts by day, and scuttling into harbours at night during the submarine's preferred hunting hours. Lifeguard duty for downed carrier pilots and B-29 flyers continued as a useful activity, but otherwise the boats had a slow and disappointing time. Some frustrated skippers took to shooting up sampans and fishing junks until that pastime began to seem unsporting. Running out of patience, a few skippers decided that if the Japanese ships refused to come out to be sunk, the submarines would go in and get them. The Barb's Eugene Fluckey dodged mines and rocks to sink at least 1 cargo ship in Nam Quan Harbour on the China coast. Still unsatisfied, Fluckey carried his private war to the land, shelling Sakhalin Island north of Japan's home islands with his deck gun and a deck-mounted rocket launcher. He even sent a nighttime commando party ashore in rubber boats to sabotage a railway. They had planted their 55-pound demolition charges and were going back to the boat when a train came down the track. Reported Fluckey, wreckage flew 200 feet in the air. Cars piled up and rolled off the tracks in a writhing, twisting mass of wreckage. Cheers. The year 1945 saw the silent service involved in only 3 noteworthy events. In June, Admiral Lockwood sent 9 submarines on a make-work patrol into the Sea of Japan. In 15 days, the pack managed to sink 28 ships of various types for a total of 54,784 tons. One submarine, the Bonefish, was lost to a depth-charge attack somewhere in the shallow Toyama Bay. The second event was the sinking of the last United States submarine to be lost in the war, bringing the service's casualties to 52 boats. On August 6th, the day the first atomic bomb was dropped on Hiroshima, a Japanese Army plane depth charged an American submarine off the coast of Bali near the northern end of Lombok Strait. The Bullhead, on patrol in that area, never came home. The final event of the war under the Pacific occurred on August 14, 1945. Commander Bafford Llewellyn's Torsk, patrolling off the southwest coast of Honshu in the Sea of Japan, torpedoed and sank a small Japanese frigate. The victim, designated Coastal Defense Vessel No. 47, was the last Japanese ship to be sunk during World War II. That night, at 11:04, Admiral Nimitz ordered all naval units to cease hostile operations. Later, writing in praise of the submariners, Nimitz did not hesitate to compare them and their record to the best. As British airmen are credited with saving Britain in those critical days after Dunkirk, so our gallant submarine personnel filled the breach after Pearl Harbor and can claim credit, not only for holding the line, but also for carrying the war to the enemy. What made the silent service a unique and overpowering success?